Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess it's noon out east. My name is Mo Kabara. I'm the CEO of the Transition Accelerator, and we're very excited to bring back these webinar series with a very exciting webinar today on the framework for industrial policy that was part of our Center for Industrial Policy launch that we had a couple of weeks ago. First, I want to acknowledge, at the Transition Accelerator, we have staff across many provinces, and we want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live. I'm actually particularly excited because the framework that we're going to be talking about today speaks about, how to move on economic reconciliation in a more meaningful way as part of industrial strategy. So for us, really, land acknowledgement is not just about something we say at the beginning of a meeting, but wanting to really deliver on that through our work, given how important economic reconciliation is for the prosperity of our country and in the future. So I'm very excited about this conversation because a couple of weeks ago we had the launch of the center, as I mentioned, and there was a lot of great conversations there in Ottawa, and figured that it's great to be able to kind of communicate that message to a broader audience, which is why we're hosting this webinar. But the backdrop really here, at the core of all of our industrial policy work, is that the global economy is shifting and is being rebuilt in real time. We can talk about things related to the pace of the energy transition. We can talk about the level of disruption, the intersection of different political, decisions and priorities. But ultimately, we are seeing transformations that are happening in supply chains, energy systems, capital flows, the industrial bases. And those assumptions are, have shaped prosperity for our previous decades in terms of the decisions that we've made as a country, and will shape the decisions we make today will shape our prosperity for the coming decades. So this is why at the Transition Accelerator, really at the core, our mission is to make sure that Canada comes out stronger economically and geopolitically as a function of all of that disruption that's happening in the energy transition. And we've seen that from other countries like the US, passing the Inflation Reduction Act, still intact for a big part. The EU, China's been acting on an industrial strategy for over 20 years and is not slowing down. And really what the Industrial Policy Center for Industrial Policy aims to do is to bring together, rigorous evidence on where Canada can compete, bring the people together that can actually work on articulating specific actions that we should take to make better decisions and translate strategies into policies that move the needle. So this is a very hard work, but we believe it's very urgent, and it's great that we've been able to mobilize a lot of folks from across the country that have expertise, not just our people. So I'm very excited to welcome our VP of Future Economy, Bentley Allen, who is going to be presenting this framework that he developed that kind of articulates what does it actually mean to have, an industrial strategy or industrial policy that works. And I think it's a very exciting way that we've already heard feedback on people trying to apply it to different sectors. So I think, looking forward to kind of having your questions in the Q&A, and we're going to have my colleague Grace, who is our senior analyst on our team, kind of facilitate discussion with Bentley afterwards. So Bentley, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mo. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. As Mo said, the center is meant to be a space for all of you. So I'm really excited to have so many friends and colleagues and hopefully new friends as well on the call today, because the center is really an invitation. We're trying to create a space where other voices can be amplified in order to bring the level of conversation around industrial policy in this country to a higher level. And that's why we're here today. And that's why I'm so glad to be sharing this time with you. So we launched the center with this framework and under the title of Canada at the Frontier. And the frontier here in the title is the global technology frontier. How do we actually elevate Canada so that it can compete in the geopolitical and fast-changing technological landscape that most comments up front alluded to? That's the purpose of the framework and the purpose of everything we do under the auspices of the Center for Industrial Policy. I always start in this context by looking to the past. And one of the exciting things about the center is that it's chaired by David Wolf, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto and one of the true deans of industrial policy scholarship in the country. And David recommended a book to me a long time ago called Ottawa Decides, and it features this really trenchant quote. The book is by Richard French, from the Science Council of Canada in 1979. And it basically said that, Canada, if we define it as having an industrial policy, which is to say any policy that affects a sector, and Canada's always had industrial policy. It's had a lot of different industrial policies. But if we define industrial strategy as a set of complementary measures that actually work together and add up to more than the sum of their parts, then Canada has never had an industrial strategy. And I find this quote so motivating, especially because now I really see the country turning a corner. Now the Carney government has at least five, three already out, two that are coming, true strategies that have means and ends. And there's really an attempt, I think, especially if you look at the auto strategy, to see how a bunch of different policies are actually going to work together to change the country. And so it's an exciting moment. And if you had told me 5 years ago that the government would have five explicitly stated industrial strategies, I would not necessarily have believed you. And certainly our friends on the Science Council in 1979 might not have agreed either. So the government now has these stated public policies, and they're there to achieve four big goals. I mean, first of all, we're in a dangerous global environment. We need to build our autonomy, our freedom of maneuver. And to do that, we need to find areas of geopolitical advantage, such as critical minerals and other resources that we can leverage in order to create power in a dangerous international system. But there's also work that we have to do at home. As Mo mentioned, the importance of Indigenous economic reconciliation to our domestic economic mission is paramount. We have to deliver economic goods, and not necessarily the goods that I think are the ones, but the ones that the communities themselves, the Indigenous communities themselves, think are the right goals and ends. But we also have an ongoing productivity crisis in this country that has been getting a lot of attention. We're lagging behind our peers in terms of our ability to translate new technology and innovation into productive ends. That productivity crisis has to be addressed at its root causes if we're actually going to compete in a global environment. So we have this huge national challenge. We have industrial strategies that are meant to achieve this challenge. However, I feel that we don't have actually the ecosystem that we used to have in 1979 when the Science Council wrote that report in a big review of all of the government's industrial strategies. A lot of the conversation about industrial strategy thus far has really been, should we or shouldn't we? Should we pick winners or not pick winners? And a lot of the public content about industrial strategy has really been at the level of think pieces, rather than doing the deep analytical work and taking a really careful analysis of what success would look like and how we are progressing towards that success. I think there's low societal capacity to support the government's industrial strategy. And that's the problem that the center is meant to resolve. It's here to build capacity around the government in support of the government at this time of intensifying national challenges. But also the government itself is facing challenges. All of these problems that we're looking at, whether it's in automotive or housing, they are cross-sectoral problems. They involve more than one government ministry, and they involve more than one domain of substantive expertise. And so the government's got to bring together a variety of different voices, expertises, actors, and political judgments into a process. But it has a lot of challenges in doing that. We have a very strong civil service in this country, and I'm really proud of our civil service in this country. But it works in silos, and it works well inside these silos. And so building that cross-silo conversation within the government is an ongoing challenge, and one that I know that the senior leadership in Ottawa is seized of and is working towards, and one that we want to support them in being able to do that. But also we've had, 2 decades of market liberalism, 4 decades of market liberalism, ideas that the government should not be intervening in the economy. And we've allowed a lot of our strategic capacities to atrophy. And when these two things are put together, a society that can't hold the government accountable and a government that's lost its ability to do cross-sectoral strategy, there's a risk that industrial strategy ends up being fragmented and reactive rather than integrated and active. And we're going to need an integrated and active strategy if we're going to compete. And that's why the center exists. It exists to raise the level of rigor and the level of public public conversation around industrial policy so that we can really understand what the government should be trying to do, what it is trying to do, and actually tally the outcomes and create accountability and measure success in a rigorous way publicly so that we can have a democratic conversation about industrial strategy and whether or not it's succeeding. In order to aid this task, I am introducing the framework today of Canada at the Frontier, which has three key components: act, realize, and achieve. Actions or activities are the concrete activities that the government needs to take part in, needs to conduct in order to have an industrial strategy. Those then turn into these intermediary outcomes, these in-between realizations of those actions, which then help us achieve these long-term goals, which are quite abstract. So the goals of addressing the productivity crisis, addressing the climate crisis, and things like that. So let's take each of these apart. Let's dive into each of them and see what we can learn. So in acting, the very first thing that the government needs to do is articulate what I call a vision and a thesis. And if I would offer one criticism of many of the government's strategies thus far, not the more recent ones, but I'm thinking of the previous government mainly, is that the strategies did not have a vision or a thesis. And here, the vision of a thesis involves looking at the global technology frontier, trying to understand where technology in a given sector is going, and then trying to create a story or a proposition about how government policies and actions will actually integrate the country's firms into that global technology firm. That's a causal claim about how policy is going to create competitiveness in a fast-moving technological environment. We can see the beginnings of this in the government's current auto strategy. Everyone, I think, now understands that EVs and especially automated electric vehicles are becoming the technological frontier in the mobility and transportation sector, and that we are behind. That we are behind both in terms of the supply chain, but also in terms of the final product itself. And that other countries, especially China, have taken the lead, and that we need to figure out exactly how we are going to position Canadian firms, Canadian knowledge, and Canadian production in that emerging technology frontier. And we have to think about that at the level of the whole supply chain, not so that we always say we're going to own the whole supply chain, but so that we can identify integrated niches within that value chain that are precise enough that we can really build strategy around them. And this is, I think, the core of industrial policy, understanding what it is that you're trying to do, offering a vision that is ambitious, but offering a thesis, which is a set of causal claims about how you're actually going to achieve that vision. This is the foundation of everything. I often say that when we are talking about industrial policy, we tend to talk a lot about policy or programs, and people tend to think that industrial policy means tariffs or subsidies or some specific policy tool. But I'm here to tell you, actually, we don't need to talk that much about policy. I will say a few words about policy in a moment. But really, I think of industrial policy as a process of collaboration between the government and society. And if you get that collaboration right, if you structure the interaction between the government and society correctly, where firms and indigenous communities and civil society voices are all at the table, then you get the flow of really high quality information. And that flow of high quality information translates into good strategic moves. And then policy, I think, kind of takes care of itself. If we are going to talk about policy, we need to think about, on the dimension along the bottom of your screen here, supply push policies and demand pull policies. Supply push policies increase the supply of technology or make that technology more competitive or more innovative. Demand pull creates a market for those technologies. And especially in clean technology or in new markets, we need that demand pull to create and realize the promise that is contained within supply push. And then government policies can be along the other axis. They can be passive and open, so any firm can take part in them, or they can be active and targeted, which is to say that they can be really focused on a specific technology or a specific set of firms. And here in Canada, I think that we have a surplus, really, of passive, open supply push policies. We've got a lot of open, structured policies that any firm is able to access. And those firms can get them, and they're mainly supply-side subsidies. And we actually are relatively weak in this arc, going from active and targeted through the demand pull side down to even passive and open demand pulls. We've watered down the carbon price, especially on the consumer side, since the start of the Carney government. The fuel regulations can sometimes send confusing demand signals, although they are there. And so we need more policies that are in the rest of the policy space so that we use the entire policy space and that in any given sector, we're combining active and targeted demand and supply policies in the right mixes in order to achieve the vision and thesis that we laid out. And again, the only way to do this properly is actually through collaboration, getting high quality information flowing between the government and other parts of society. Um, Realization, I think, is really the core of the framework and the core of what I'm hoping that the center will do, which is really help to clarify all this messy stuff that we talk about in the industrial policy conversation and put it into a specific framework. So here I make the distinction between mechanisms and targets. Mechanisms are how we know that an industrial strategy is creating real capability in an economy. And here I propose a bunch of indicators or statistics that we talk about a lot, but I'm giving them a purpose here. They tell us whether or not we're building capability. Capability here is the knowledge that exists amongst a set of firms and universities and other civil society organizations and indigenous communities and regional knowledge clusters. Capability is what exists in these concrete spaces to produce the knowledge necessary to be competitive. And that knowledge could be production, it could be innovation, it could be science, it could be process. There's lots of ways in which knowledge matters in an economy, but mechanisms tell us that knowledge is being built. We can see that when firms scale. So knowing the number of Canadian firms that are going from a startup stage to a commercialization stage into a growth stage. We know that in terms of number of dollars of investment, research and development spent, patents created, and also new ecosystem institutions. So we'll say more about this a little bit later, but the idea is that there are assets that can bring all of the different actors together in a specific location to combine knowledge in new and creative way. So one example might be foreign direct investment. And we're going to do some work at the center to create a data observatory. We'll have an announcement about that later this week or early next week, or maybe the week after that, sometime soon. Keep your eyes peeled on centerforindustrialpolicy.ca, where we're going to be presenting some of the data that you'll see here today in a format that allows you to explore and look at it. So here we're looking at greenfield foreign direct investment. So this takes out mergers and acquisitions out of the data and really just puts greenfield new projects on the table. You can see there's a lot of noise in the data. The Canada line especially squiggles up and down. So actually it makes sense to put it on a rolling average. And so you can see here in the 3-year rolling average, we've got a slight uptick in FDI in 2024 here. And that data actually does carry through into 2025. But here in the comparison, you can see actually that FDI into some of our peer competitors, like Sweden and South Korea, has jumped a little bit higher actually. Than ours is. So we're actually lagging behind our peers, even though we're doing quite well in terms of FDI numbers. But the real question in foreign direct investment is not whether or not assets are coming in and factories are getting created here in Canada. It's whether or not those factories are ending up as enclaves within the economy or whether we're really producing capability around them. Is it connecting to other innovation centers in a way that allows that battery factory to not just be a place where there's 3,000 jobs, but allows it to be interconnected to the metals and mining and metallurgy and chemistry industries that are in the surrounding environment, right? If we just have Korea come here and make a bunch of submarines with a fully Korean supply chain and a fully Korean workforce, then we haven't produced any economic value for Canada, except on paper. And we want to create more than paper value. We want to create real value. So what indicators besides FDI could actually tell us that? Well, business expenditure and research and development is one. Are those companies that are coming here spending money on research and development in Canada? The problem that we have in Canada is that so many of our big companies are foreign companies and their headquarters are back at home. And that means their R&D assets are back at home. So conditioning any kind of policy incentives that we give on locating research and development assets here is the kind of smart move that we would like to see. We can also look at this here. This is in the manufacturing sectors specifically that you can see BIRD in Canada is quite flat. And so even though we spend a lot of public money on research and development, we're just not seeing the levels of private expenditure on research and development that we need here. One thing that we're hoping to really develop is another way of mapping capabilities at the granular level here in the center. And this is another teaser. We'll have this map, an interactive form available for everybody to look at and click around and explore in a few weeks up on the center website. But the idea here is to look at clusters of firms so that we understand what forms of knowledge exist in what places here in Canada. You can see here in Montreal, we have a digital systems cluster and an aerospace cluster that makes it an excellent place to create drones and contribute to our defense industrial strategy because of the form of knowledge that exists at that place. So we could actually start measuring capability clusters over time. And then we could match that up with FDI and show, are foreign direct investments actually creating knowledge and capabilities at the local level in Canadian jurisdictions? These are the kinds of questions we need to ask at this realization mechanism level if we really want to understand whether or not an industrial strategy is working. And I would say that this is not the only way to think about these questions. And again, the center is an invitation. And if you have an idea about how to measure the creation of knowledge and capability in the economy, we want to hear about it. We want to talk about it. The second part of the realization framework is targets. These are indicators of progress in the economy. They help us identify which communities and sectors and technologies are succeeding and which are not. And here we can look at something like total manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP. Is the manufacturing sector actually growing in Canada? And we can see here that even though it's growing in South Korea and shrinking quite a bit in Australia, the solid line is the 2022 dot. The solid dot is the 2022 dot. Sweden and South Korea are increasing their manufacturing value added, whereas Australia and Canada are stuck or slightly receding. And we can also decompose this by sector. So looking at this in computer and electronics, we actually have more than 1% of the GDP in manufacturing in the computer and electronics sector, which was a surprise to me, especially when you compare it to motor vehicles, which used to be about just above 1%. And now you can see the manufacturing value added in motor vehicles really sliding down into below 1%. And you can see in other sectors, it's holding steady, transportation equipment broadly and electrical equipment broadly. But you can see Korea is really providing an example here. And of course, I would submit that it's the strategic enterprise that the government of South Korea engages in, their industrial strategy that allows them to create this capacity and this geopolitical leverage, this high technology manufacturing sector that is the envy of the world and that is a high export growth sector. You can see the strategy paying off here, at least in a couple of sectors. This is the domestic value added share of exports. So this is when we look at our exports. Are we increasing or decreasing the Canadian content of those exports? So again, you can see in motor vehicles in Canada, it used to be that more than half of the value add of our export dollar in motor vehicles was Canadian value added. Now it's dropped below 50% and is going negative. Basic metals, on the other hand, in metal, the Canadian content is increasing. That means more nickel coming into that metal value chain, more other metals and minerals coming into that value chain. That's a good, successful story for Canadian critical minerals industrial strategy and metal industrial strategy. You can see here generally the mining of metal ores also has more Canadian content in it than it used to. Anyway, these are the kinds of granular things that I think we need to track if we really want to understand whether or not we're succeeding, both at the level of mechanisms, the creation of capabilities, or targets, whether or not communities are actually succeeding. And I just want to pause here. One of the targets that I didn't talk about is Indigenous economic development, but it is something that's really important to me and to the center. And we're going to be partnering with organizations here in Canada to really think about what Indigenous economic development can mean, and broader, what Indigenous economic reconciliation means as part of an industrial strategy, because we do have a real opportunity in Canada to carve a new strategy for industrial strategy in the world, which is one that takes seriously economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples as being a key component of its industrial strategy. And that's why it's such an important part of the achieve component of this framework. I mean, in the end, economic data and just getting stuck in indicators can be seductive. But at the end of the day, in order for industrial policy to succeed, it needs to be rooted in what we call public purpose or collective purpose. The idea that we can work together in order to achieve a better society. And one of the things that an industrial strategy lens gives us is this idea that we can submit to democratic processes a collective vision of what we can and should be. And it's that collective vision of what we can and should be that underwrites a truly democratic vision of industrial policy, and one that we need. And that vision is even more important because industrial strategy is very difficult. It happens under deep uncertainty, and it requires feedback from individuals and communities in order to be successfully updated over time. And what I'm hoping that the center framework provides is a clear framework that allows us to have that democratic conversation about industrial strategy that we need in a world of geopolitical dangers and the necessity of strategy. But that strategy is always going to be wrong the first time, and therefore it requires democratic feedback and channels of accountability in order to be revised in light of the evidence collectively together. And I really do want you all to join me in that enterprise. And I'm glad to say we have a little bit of time for conversation to get started on that process here today with Grace, as Mo indicated.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bentley. So yeah, before we go any further, just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Grace Newcomb, a senior analyst with the Transition Accelerator. I'll be asking Bentley some questions today, starting with one of our own before turning to audience Q&A. But before that, what stood out to me with your presentation is this emphasis on moving beyond announcements and instruments towards this clearer understanding of what industrial policy is actually producing, if anything at all. And that seems especially relevant in this Canadian context, where a lot of the current conversation is about funds, strategies, sectoral priorities, autonomy, as you mentioned. But the harder question is whether those efforts are actually adding up to any durable capabilities. And so I think the Act, Realize, Achieve framework is useful precisely because it creates this structure for connecting government activity to measurable outcomes and broader goals. But then, of course, this then raises a practical question about implementation. So what it takes to measure progress in real time and also who is responsible for doing so. So with that, my question to you, and you alluded to this towards the end of your presentation, is you draw a clear line between industrial policy and industrial strategy and argue that Canada has had plenty of the former, but not so much of the latter. So what would it actually take to build strategic coherence and to deploy an industrial strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Grace. I think, again, it really does come down to the integration of different kinds of knowledge. And I find industrial strategy, especially in this moment, to be really difficult. And even when we were launching the center and trying to think about who we wanted to work with, one of the things that I wanted most of all was to be able to understand a concrete policy landscape, like just list everything that the government is doing in a particular sector. Even that is a difficult enterprise, right? And it requires a certain specialization and expertise in order to do that. But then you also have to match that up with a very clear idea of what the technological frontier is in a particular sector. So at the very least, even to have a sensible conversation about strategy, you need to be talking about technology at a high level of granularity and policy at a high level of granularity. And then you have to merge those. But then you have to have that conversation at the domestic level. So you need people who understand the regional structures and clusters in the economy. And you also have to have that conversation at a global level. What's happening globally? What is Canada's position? What are those specific regional positions within the global position? So the answer really is integration of different forms of knowledge. It's integration of different forms of expertise. And the way that we can really do that, and this is a little bit of a wonky point, I think, is to create knowledge itself that is combined, right? So if we can, in the center, bring together knowledge of policy and make it precise and make it clear, like in those frameworks that I presented, but do that at the sectoral level. And then we also can do technological scans that are forward-looking. Then we're providing those inputs, those critical technology-specific, but also policy-specific inputs that will enable the creation of coherent strategy at the intersection of the two. And I actually think that the government is starting to get there. And as I said, I think the auto sector strategy is an excellent example because it brings together a technologically specific thesis that we need to be doing EVs, that we need to be maximizing the Canadian content along the whole value chain. It brings that into contact with what is already a complex policy mix in the sector. But what I liked about the auto strategy is that it really said these are the 5 tools, and these are what each of the purposes of those 5 tools are. So I just think we need that. We need that in every sector. And you can see the beginnings of it happening in the buildings sector as well, where again, there's a technologically specific thesis that we need more modern methods of construction in the industry. And we're starting to get a sense of what the policy mix would look like in order to incentivize that at scale. So yeah, very quick answer to that question. But that's, I think, how we move from policy, where we've just added a bunch of reactive policy mechanisms through this budget and that budget and this budget and that budget. And we ended up with a long list, but we didn't look at how they were fitting together into the kind of framework that I presented here. We have to shift from that to, okay, technology specific thesis, policy mix is actually delivering on that thesis or not.
Okay, amazing. Thank you for that answer. So let's turn to some audience questions. And before I start with these, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, so I can pull them out. Okay, so first off, are we able to see how much of foreign investment is going into housing or real estate? Does this type of foreign investment benefit our economy?
Yes, I mean you can parse that out of the data, and again we can look at foreign direct investment by the sectoral level. So we can see how much of it is going into residential construction or how much of it is going into just purchases, cash transfers, versus how much is actually going into manufacturing or electric. And then we can decompose it by what it's actually going into in manufacturing, whether it's electrical or et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there is, I think, a general problem in the housing sector. And I think if you look at what British Columbia has done with the speculation and vacancy tax, for example, it's a direct attempt to try to, as well as the foreign buyer ban, it's a direct, attempt to realize that this is a big problem and that we actually just need to make sure that the housing sector in Canada is reserved for Canadians and permanent residents and people who are on the pathway to citizenship first, and everybody else second. And I think that's a critical thing. And I think that without getting too much into it, that we can open up from that conversation into a broader conversation about the role of the financial sector in the economy and in the manufacturing sector in general. And that conversation, I think, needs to be quite detailed in this country. How is it that we are thinking about the role of money and the role of investment, and where is that investment going? And how can we channel more dollars into productive investment, into nation building? And I think obviously we have a prime minister who is probably the best person in the world in order to answer that question, and whether or not he can politically make the things happen that he knows are right from a productive deployment of capital perspective, that's a separate question. But yeah, I love this idea that we really need to think critically about money flowing into the country and how to deploy that money in the most productive fashion. Great question.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And I'm just going to quickly throw to Mo as well, for comment, to see if you also have an answer to this question.
No, I'm good. Thanks. Sorry, I was having trouble opening my mic and camera. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Perfect. So on to the next question, Bentley. So as geopolitical tensions reshape global trade and industrial policy, how can Canada avoid treating climate action as a competing priority rather than a driver of long-term economic resilience and competitiveness?
Yeah, this is a great question and one that is close to my heart. I've been arguing for 5 years now that there's no trade-off here, that climate action is geopolitical, and that not only that, but it strengthens our geopolitics. And I think that if we take a really hard look at the way that oil and gas markets are developing globally, the current conditions created by the war notwithstanding, the war in Iran notwithstanding, we were looking at really structurally weak oil prices. And I remember even at the beginning of the war, there was an analyst on Bloomberg saying that Bloomberg Intelligence's key benchmark forecast for the year was $40 at the end of November, because we were really structurally out of demand increases and there was a lot of supply coming online. And I think in that environment, it'd be very difficult to be having a pipeline conversation right now, right? We're having a pipeline conversation in part because of the disruption caused by the war. So again, I don't there's this argument that oil and gas would make us more geopolitically resilient, but I think that that's something that we have to submit to evidence, and that's something that we can have a public conversation about and a real robust debate about. But if you look at critical minerals, if you look at automotive and EVs and also high value add components in value chains. If you look at the chemical sector more broadly, look at what the Hormuz Strait has caused a problem with. It's caused a problem with things like helium and other gases that we would be excellent at producing if we reoriented our chemical sector towards producing them in a low carbon manner. These things are geopolitical, but they're also climate action. And I think that we're really well placed to combine these two in strong ways. And critical minerals would be the place that I would start, with a really big, aggressive portfolio of demand pull levers that were used to create Canadian mining capacity and processing capacity. And that would create a variety of well-priced metals that then could come into the value chain and help to accelerate investment downstream in the kinds of midstream products that would enable us to do the transition. I also think of electricity, again, investments in our grid, investments in electricity generation will help us build sovereignty, but will also help us decarbonize. These are things that I think are just no-brainers, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And I honestly think that if we just look at the evidence on oil and gas markets globally, then we won't make the wrong decision there.
And so I have another question here that sort of links a little bit to what you were saying. Is there any concern if growth is mostly focused in the development and export of commodities that are not exported at a level of supply chain that creates the most value over the longer term, especially as emerging markets will develop capacity in areas like mining, for example?
Give it to me again. There was a lot of parts there.
Yeah, there was a lot of parts. So is there any concern if growth is mostly focused in the development and export of commodities that are not exported at a level of supply chain that creates the most value over the longer term? So for example,
I think no matter what, we have to have an export strategy no matter what. We're a small open economy. And we're going to live or die on our exports. We don't have to have a huge export surplus, but we certainly need to export as much as we import. And we have $190 billion of oil and gas exports, and I think that number is going to go down over the next 25 years. So any survival strategy for the country has to be an export strategy, right? And then add on top of that the need to maybe reduce reliance on the United States for that export and for that trade. And then you have a compounded problem, right? How are we going to manage to increase exports in this environment? So I think any of our strategies have to be an export strategy fundamentally. And I think that's part of the reason why I like critical minerals and value-added wood and value-added mass timber, things like that, because these are ways of taking something that we do at the resource level, adding value to them down the supply chain, and then exporting that material, right? So in the battery value chain, I think it makes sense not just to mine the material, but to process it and turn it into cathode and then export that. That's going to be something that countries are looking for an ex-China supply of. And that will give us, I think, some resilience. And if we're really serious about building the Middle Power Alliance, these are the kinds of products that our allies are going to want and going to need and will want a non-China supply of. So I think that we really have to be thinking about exports no matter what. We do want to be building integrated supply chains here in the country, but we should always be looking to exceed national demand, and we certainly shouldn't be looking to force domestic demand, right? So one way to do that, which is commonly equated with industrial strategy, is domestic content requirements. And there's certainly a role for domestic content requirements, just saying that you have to buy Canadian or that you have to buy Canadian in this particular value chain. I just think that kind of policy has to be really finely calibrated. It has to be deployed very sparingly, because basically what you do when you do that is you go to domestic producers of that product and say, would you like to set the price for this product? You're basically giving a kind of monopoly unless you have a really competitive industry in that market segment in order to produce a wide variety of it. So you have to be really careful with domestic content requirements. They have to be deployed sparingly. And the other thing that does is that it basically makes particular sectors not have to compete with the globe, which is the worst outcome for Canadians, right? You want Canadian firms to have to interact with global firms in a competitive landscape.
So, in the absence of a strong sovereign wealth fund, how can Canada adjust its short and long-term energy strategies? Could Carney's recently announced sovereign wealth fund help Canada's resilience in this?
I certainly think there's a strong role for the sovereign wealth fund. I think it's a great idea. We'll be really excited to see what the details of it are and what kinds of investments and verticals we're going to be looking at for that. How it overlaps with the Critical Minerals Sovereign Fund, the Strategic Innovation Fund, the CIB, and other things is, I think, remaining to be seen. But having a patient capital investor in the mix, having a strategic entity that can, take the riskier part of an investment and de-risk the entry of private capital into certain sectors or projects is going to be really useful. It's going to be a really important part of the toolkit, and one that yeah, I applaud and think has a critical role. But again, I think whenever we create a new fund in Canada, the question is not like, can this be useful? The question is in the operationalization and the measurement and the accountability around it. So, does it have a defined niche that it's trying to invest in? How are we going to assess whether or not those investments are productive and additional for the government's strategy? All this is really important to consider.
Okay. And so another question here we have is to do with Canada's position and internationally. And so, what are the steps involved if we want to develop a Canada-focused industrial strategy that also aims for win-win partnerships with other middle powers and also
Yeah.
global South countries looking to maintain economic and governance autonomy?
Yeah, we've been looking a lot at the complementarity between Canada and the other middle powers to think about how we might reroute supply chains to be more integrated with one another to build that interdependence that would underlie some kind of long-term cooperation between Canada and the middle powers. And that would also build the geopolitical leverage that the Prime Minister talked about in the Davos speech. I think this is a critical mission for the country long term. I was just back from Oxford University where I gave a paper, and the argument of the paper is that every domestic industrial strategy needs a grand strategy. It needs a global international strategy for how you're going to position the country vis-a-vis other countries. And one thing I love about the Carney government's agenda right now is that they have a grand strategy, and it's this middle power alliance. But you need to be serious about it and really work towards it. And Canada, I think, has a lot to offer the middle power alliance. This is not just government messaging. I really think we do have critical minerals and chemicals capabilities that the rest of the Middle Power Alliance needs. And countries like Germany and Korea have the final assembly and the precision components that we need in order to build up that part of our supply chain. So there's real complementarities, I think, amongst the middle powers in defense, in batteries, in semiconductors, in life sciences, in other sectors as well, other clean technology sectors as well. And so I think that there's a real tangible benefit that we can collectively produce through deep cooperation amongst the middle powers. The thing that I would say is that we need to be serious about how we're going to deliver on that, though, because just saying something doesn't make it so. Just saying that there's an opportunity doesn't mean that we're actually going to reroute supply chains. So in critical minerals, for example, I think Indonesian nickel is always going to be there to undercut Canadian nickel on price. We're going to have to backstop the price of nickel. We're going to have to use contract for difference, which is a tool that we've talked about a lot in the TA, in order to ensure that Canadian feed is part of the mix for the global middle power alliance. And in fact, what we're going to need is for partners like Japan and other folks to show up and actually help us do that in Canadian mines. And in fact, this was a part of Minister Hodgson's plan in the G7 Buyers Alliance. But we still need to deliver on it. Japan was supposed to take 15,000 tons of Nouveau Monde graphite with an offtake agreement, and we need them to show up and do that. And then we need folks to do that for nickel and copper and other things as well.
Okay, excellent. And so now to just turn back more domestically. So in Quebec, there is political pushback from most opposition parties against government intervention in the economy after the Northvolt failure, and other similar ones. So my question is, how would you like the industrial policy debate to be framed as we head into the Quebec fall provincial election?
Yeah, I think there's no world in which the government doesn't intervene in the economy. People often say that governments shouldn't pick winners. The thing is, we never stopped picking winners. We never stopped having the strategic deployment of government capital, even under market liberalism, right? We said we weren't doing it. We made ourselves devoid of the strategic capacity to make strong, good decisions. And we stopped as a public having a robust debate about whether or not those choices were the right choices. But the government never stopped supporting certain sectors rather than others, right? If you look at the aerospace sector in Quebec, it's a product of industrial policy at the provincial and at the federal level going back 6 decades. There's just no other way to have the conversation that's sensible other than to start with those basic facts, right? It's the same in the auto sector, right? We bailed out the auto sector in 2008. We've supported it structurally. One of the papers that we commissioned for the launch of the center, Greg Mordieu and James Meadowcroft wrote a great paper on the auto sector, and I want to invite all the members of the audience to look at the other papers. There's one on buildings and industrialized construction, and there's also one on defense and dual use, building the dual use innovation commons that we need in order to have a strong defense manufacturing base. And really grateful for all the partners that contributed to the center launch through their writing and research. But Greg's paper has this line in it, the Canadian auto sector is a product of industrial strategy, full stop. So having a conversation about Northvolt is a great conversation to have. What went wrong there? Was that the right decision? And Northvolt as a company is a really interesting example. I think it's interesting to me because the leader of Northvolt was supposed to be ex-Tesla, was ex-Tesla. And Tesla is one of the companies that had just a really precise playbook. And that precise playbook was know exactly what your strategy is and build a revenue stream before you do anything else. And Northvolt had the exact opposite strategy. It spent cash on all kinds of things that were not its direct revenue stream, that were not its direct business model before it had a revenue stream. And so, Northvolt got overextended, and it partly got overextended because too many governments gave it too much money without having strategic discipline around it. And I think that speaks to me to be more an indictment of the conversation that we're having around the firm and the conversation around industrial policy than it does of industrial policy per se, especially if you start from the premise that I do, which is that the government's going to have an industrial policy. Whether or not it has an industrial strategy, the coherent integration of policy tools, that's up for debate. And that's our job, is to make sure that the conversation is at a sophisticated level so the government knows that it needs to have a really strong industrial policy. So in Quebec specifically, I would want to frame it explicitly about what do you think public capital and public funds should be used for? What is the strategic vision? What is the thesis? Those are the kinds of things that I would like to see debated by policymakers. And I would like to have them be at a level of sophistication to be able to have this conversation with us. And this isn't just a pipe dream. In South Korea and in Sweden and in other countries where industrial strategy is just taken for granted as being part of what the government does, policymakers of all kinds can have intelligent and detailed conversations about the industrial strategy of the government. And we need to get to the same level in Canada.
Okay, excellent. And so with kind of linked to sort of this domestic and just industrial capacity or capability plus the role of government, I have two questions here that are sort of linked in some ways. So the first being, in the context of an industrial strategy, what are your thoughts on the definition of advancing Canadian IP with public funding or initiatives? And then the second is, how can you do effective industrial policy when government itself is a market participant? For example, the government of Canada owns nuclear IP with CANDU, yet there are many other players in non-CANDU nuclear energy build-out, for example, the SMR project at Darlington.
Yeah, that's great. So intellectual property is a critical piece of this. And I think we have to have a really strong and serious conversation about what we're doing with intellectual property. I think the first thing I would say is that intellectual property tends to be owned by firms. And what we need to do if we want to keep intellectual property that is produced in Canada with public money in Canada is scale those firms as domestic champions and keep them. But to do that, we need investment, right? We need that financial conversation we were talking about earlier. So those firms have the capital that they need to scale at home. instead of just leave. But we also need to have ecosystems here that support the creation of intellectual property and the holding of intellectual property around those firms. And I think that's really critical. There are lots of legal and other policy measures that need to be taken as well in order to ensure that intellectual property is kept here. But that's the first and foremost, right? That we need to be able to scale our own companies here so that they can make use of their intellectual property here, keep their research and development assets here, therefore keep the innovation engine here. But there's also connectivity to other assets that is important there. We tend to have too much focus on novelty, on the creation of intellectual property or the creation of the patent, rather than the application of it in production processes and manufacturing processes and chemical production processes, so that improvements can happen. Danny Bresnitz, the distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, distinguishes between primary innovation and secondary innovation and makes the case that secondary innovation is way more important than we think that it is. This is innovation that happens on top of existing processes, right? It's the creation of knowledge on top of things that are producing. So, and that tends to also then go and produce intellectual property. It produces patents because you can actually produce things in situ that then cause innovation to happen. And we need to integrate these things in a way that is more sophisticated. I think the second question is really interesting. My first reaction is that the government doesn't act as a strategic market actor in the same way that a firm does. And so that potential conflict of interest in the nuclear space, for example, isn't as severe. And the other thing that would reduce the potential conflict of interest would be the fact that the provinces have a play here, especially in nuclear, right? So obviously, the province of Ontario, OPG, they made the decision to have a Hitachi facility, not a CANDU. And they're free to make that decision. And in an industrial strategy that has lots of different decision makers, you can actually take advantage of the fact that you've got different knowledge bases in each of the provinces and territories and indigenous nations and make an active use of that knowledge process and that debate and that experimentalism in a way that strengthens industrial strategy in the long run. Something that the Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example, might do, though, is decide that it wants to hold intellectual property, that it actually wants to buy up things from firms and then license out of that, maybe at a discounted rate to domestic firms and a higher rate to international firms. Something like this is really important. I think what happened with Hydro-Quebec is that it basically created the intellectual property that allowed lithium ion phosphate batteries to be commercialized, and we let China have that patent for free, and they used it to build CATL and the other LFP giants in China, and now we are paying for the pleasure of re-importing that knowledge that they created on top of our intellectual property. And especially at times like right now where the EV sector is weak, there are firms going out of business in Europe like Northvolt and the United States and Canada. It would be really useful to have a government agent that could come around and buy up IP in this current environment so as to prevent that IP from being purchased by China, which is exactly what China did between 2011 and 2014, when the solar and the battery sector in the United States went defunct, essentially, and China bought up all of the good companies and again absorbed them into that intellectual property advantage that it already had. So a sovereign wealth fund that could scoop up more IP would be, I think, really useful in the current environment. And as the second question raises, there's a bunch of questions about how we'd have to manage that and ensure competition, et cetera, et cetera. But I have a feeling we could do a good job of that. The more important thing is keeping Canadian IP available to Canadian firms and to be maximized as Canadian.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we have approximately 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to pull out one more question before handing it back to you, Bentley.
You've learned that I have nothing but long answers. So we have one question left.
Long answers are good. This is the information that we're looking for. So one of the policies that you pulled up on your slides referred to carbon pricing. And one of the questions is, how can our carbon pricing align with EU CBAM requirements, so carbon border adjustment mechanism requirements? And can carbon border adjustments be a positive cost of global market access without the risk of carbon leakage to bigger EU and Asian manufacturing powers?
Yeah, I think that the question of whether or not we should integrate with the CBAM is a good one. I think that we're in a really difficult position, right? Because again, we're trying to change tack between the United States on the one hand and Europe on the other. And any CBAM will clearly be part of CUSMA negotiations or something like that if we were to implement something like that. This was easier under the Biden administration when this was talked about in a serious way by Republican senators like Republican Senator Bill Cassidy and others, actually seriously taking a CBAM proposal to their colleagues and having a robust discussion about it. Those are the bigger risks in my mind. I mean, I think, again, probably we could operationalize a CBAM in a way that made sense. I do think it's difficult to do that. I think that the Europe is having some difficulty with it right now. And just in general, the idea that we would have a tax that is associated with the carbon intensity of the product, it's a difficult technical matter, which obviously is there to protect German industry and to protect European industry from other industries. But if it's not open to countries in the global south, we had a couple questions about that earlier, which I didn't really get to, then it risks being called out as the European CBAM was as a colonial tool. The Indians decried the CBAM or have decried the CBAM and continue to do so because they're very worried about it basically excluding Indian steel from the European market, regardless of the carbon intensity of any specific asset. And there's a technical question, right, about whether or not you apply the CBAM to a country as a whole based on the average intensity of steel coming out of that economy, or at the asset level, which is much more intense from a bureaucratic standpoint in terms of assessing the carbon intensity of steel coming from a specific asset for all of the assets in India or Indonesia or whatever. So these things get really complicated really quickly, and it would take us a while in order to get technically up to speed in order to be able to administer these things, unless we just copied the European framework, in which case we're going to make the Americans annoyed because the Americans and the Europeans already tried to tie together their steel industries through the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum. And that blew up precisely on these kinds of technical questions because there's differences in the way that those industries are structured in Europe and the United States. So certainly carbon pricing can be a tool in the Canadian context, and long term, there's no way to protect Canadian industry with high carbon prices domestically without something like a CBAM. But I just don't currently see a clear policy path forward for CBAM in the country, given the difficulty of and how many balls are in the air geopolitically. We just have to settle some of those balls first before we can have a serious conversation about that, I think.
Great. So with that was our final question. So firstly, thank you everyone for all of their questions. We had so many, so I apologize for not being able to get around to all of them.
Amazing
Bentley,
conversation.
If you have a couple of closing remarks, this is your opportunity for the last word, and then we'll hand it back to Mo to close.
I'm just so pleased that we had those were great questions, and I'm really excited to be here and to invite all of you to take part in the center. So please reach out to us, find me on LinkedIn, and let's have a chat about how you can contribute to the center.
Awesome. Thanks, Bentley and Grace, for the great conversation, great presentation, Bentley. So I just want to reiterate a couple of things. I really feel like this is a good moment for us as a country to move forward on industrial strategy in a different way. And what we're trying to do, as Bentley mentioned, is to really help provide the information and the connection, right? So there's not going to be a single market actor here that is going to solve this. There's not going to be a single level of government that is going to solve this. And what the center is really trying to do, and what the Transition Accelerator is trying to do through all of our work, is to make sure that we have better information and better path for implementation through the collaboration frameworks that we're proposing. So really appreciate everybody's engagement on the webinar. It's great to kind of be you see the questions, but also the comments. We're going to be putting out these types of webinars again more often as you're used to. And we subscribe to the center's mailing list. We're going to be producing a lot more products, as Bentley mentioned, specifically some of the tools that you can kind of play around with to look at some of the metrics and measuring what success looks like. So with that, really grateful for everybody participating today. And thanks again to Grace and Bentley for the presentation and for the conversation.